Have you ever wondered if a day might come when you forget your own grandchild's name, or walked into the living room, then suddenly had no idea why you were there? I used to think things like that were just normal parts of getting older. Just age catching up with me, I told myself. My name is David. I'm 73 years old and live in Oregon. I was a high school history teacher for over 30 years. Now that I'm retired, my mornings are quiet. I sit on the porch, sip a cup of black coffee I brew myself, and read whatever book I've got in hand. Everything had been peaceful and routine until last Thursday morning. While reading outside, I suddenly couldn't remember a very common word. I knew it. I had just thought about it. It was right there at the tip of my tongue, but I couldn't say it. And that moment, it shook me. I felt a kind of fear I hadn't known before. So I made an appointment with Dr. Laura Kim, a 48-year-old neurologist who had once treated a close friend of mine. After running a few brain scans and memory tests, I sat down with her at her clinic. But instead of jumping straight into the results, she began by asking me a few unexpected questions. Do you find yourself telling the same story over and over again? Do you have trouble focusing when you're in a group conversation? Do you sometimes forget what day of the week it is? Each question felt like it opened a little door in my memory. And that's when I realized something important. There are early, quiet signs that your memory is starting to decline. Signs that most people miss until it's too late. So today, I want to share my story. Specifically, the 7 early warning signs that Dr. Laura helped me uncover. I'll walk you through each one, how it shows up, and how to tell whether it's just normal aging or something more serious. And by the end, I'll also share 3 changes I made to help protect my brain, starting that very same week. Now let's talk about the first quiet sign, one that seems harmless on the surface, but in truth, it's a warning bell. Even younger people have experienced it. It's the inability to stay focused. I started noticing that my attention drifted easily. I'd sit down to write a note but find myself reaching for my phone. Or I'd be reading a book and have to reread the same paragraph because I couldn't remember what I had just read. At first, I thought it was just aging. Maybe I didn't sleep well, but it kept happening, more and more often. During my follow-up with Dr. Laura, I mentioned it to her. She wasn't surprised at all. She said many people over 60 think they're just being forgetful. But what's really happening is a decline in sustained attention, a function controlled by the frontal lobe of the brain. She explained that when the brain starts to decline, it doesn't lose memory right away. It first loses the ability to block out distractions. So your mind can't focus long enough to turn experiences into memory. She described it like trying to see through a foggy pair of glasses. You can still see, but nothing's sharp or clear. I asked her if there was a way to improve it. Laura nodded and gave me a simple strategy: work in 20 to 30-minute blocks. No interruptions. Set a timer. Silence your notifications. Do one task at a time. When your brain learns to stay in one place, it starts remembering again. So I gave it a try during my morning reading sessions, and within a week, something changed. My mind felt clearer. I didn't need to reread paragraphs over and over, and for the first time in a while, I felt confident about my memory. But then Laura said something that stuck with me. If you only train your focus and ignore the 3 core factors, your brain won't improve for the long run. She told me to keep an eye out for other signs, that once I noticed enough of them, I'd understand why those 3 factors matter so much. And I'll explain those at the end of the video. Now let's move on to the second sign, one that I didn't even notice myself. It was my son who pointed it out. One morning, the two of us were sitting on the porch, having coffee like we always do. I started telling him a story from my days as a teacher, I remembered it vividly, and I thought it was the first time I had shared it. But my son just smiled and said, "Dad, you told me that story yesterday. Actually, you've been telling a part of it every day this week." I froze for a second. I had no idea I was repeating myself. To me, it felt like something fresh. That's when I remembered one of the questions Dr. Laura had asked during my first visit. Do you find yourself repeating the same story, even when you believe it's the first time you've told it? Back then, I wasn't sure, but now I understood. This is an early sign that the brain is struggling to separate short-term memory from long-term memory. Dr. Laura explained it like this. When the hippocampus, the part of the brain responsible for forming and organizing memories, starts to weaken, your brain doesn't properly register that you already told the story. It doesn't create a time stamp, so you feel like the memory is new, even though the listener has already heard it before. I asked her, "Can this be improved?" She nodded and told me one of the best ways to strengthen that part of the brain is to introduce novelty into your daily life. That could be something as simple as learning a new word, taking a different route on your walk, or writing in a journal each morning to reflect on what you did the day before. So I started doing something small. Every morning I wrote one sentence. What story did I share yesterday and with whom? It felt a little strange at first, but gradually I noticed a change. I stopped repeating myself. I started remembering the flow of conversations more clearly, and my son stopped gently reminding me that I had already told that story. For the first time in a while, I felt capable, like my memory was still mine to protect. But Laura didn't stop there. She said to me, "David, what you're seeing now are just the symptoms on the surface. If you really want to hold on to your memory in the long run, you have to look at what fuels your brain every single day." I didn't fully understand what she meant at the time, but as more signs revealed themselves, I started to see the bigger picture. Now let's go to the third sign, something I always brushed off as a small thing, until it started affecting my confidence too. I used to be someone who was always on time. Back when I was still teaching, I made it a point to arrive at the classroom at least 15 minutes before my students. Even after I retired, I kept the habit of writing down every appointment either on paper or in my phone. But then, things started to slip. Last week, I had an eye doctor appointment at 9 a.m. I clearly remembered writing it down. That morning, I was calmly sitting outside, reading and sipping my coffee. Then the phone rang. It was the nurse. "Mr. David, the doctor has been waiting for you for the past 15 minutes. I froze. I pulled up my calendar and sure enough it was there, but I had completely forgotten. And it wasn't the first time. Recently I had missed a few things. A golf game with a friend, a birthday call to my granddaughter, even picking up my prescription after visiting the pharmacy. It started to worry me. So I told all of this to Dr. Laura at my follow-up appointment. She didn't seem surprised. She said, "David, this isn't about being lazy or careless. Your brain is gradually losing something called prospective memory. It's what helps us remember to do something in the future, especially things we consider important." I asked her, "Is there any way to train that part of the brain again?" She nodded. Prospective memory, she explained, can be strengthened by linking emotional meaning or visual imagery to a task. For example, instead of just writing "eye appointment," I started writing "eye check," so I can keep reading clearly every morning. By tying the action to an emotional goal, my brain had something more to hold on to. Laura also suggested trying visualization. Each night before bed, I spent just 3 minutes imagining what I would do the next day, where I'd go, who I'd see, what I'd say. After just a week, I started forgetting less. It felt like I was retraining my brain, not with medication but with simple tools like emotion, handwriting, and imagery. But then something else happened, something that shook me more than all the missed appointments combined. One evening, while watching the news, I realized I couldn't follow the story being told. I heard every sentence, but none of it made sense. And that was the moment I entered the fourth sign, one you shouldn't ignore if it ever happens to you. I remember it was a Saturday night. I was sitting in the living room, watching the evening news, just like I always did. The anchor was reporting on a major lawsuit happening in another state. It was a complex story. Who sued who, why it happened, and a timeline that stretched over an entire year. But just a few minutes in, I realized I couldn't follow. I heard every sentence, every detail, but I couldn't connect the dots. Everything started to feel jumbled. Instead of trying to make sense of it, I picked up the remote and turned off the TV. That moment hit me hard. I used to be a history teacher. Stories, facts, and timelines were my entire world. But now, I felt like I was getting lost in the very things that used to be second nature. I told Dr. Laura about this during my next follow-up. She looked at me and said, "David, this isn't about intelligence. Your brain is having trouble processing multi-step logic, something that's often tied to the frontal lobe and hippocampus." She explained that after the age of 60, the brain's ability to transfer signals between regions slows down, and that makes it harder to analyze and follow complex information. Then she shared a study from the University of California, published in 2017. It found that seniors over 65 with mild cognitive decline had up to a 40% lower ability to follow multi-step stories compared to those without it. I sat there quietly for a while. I thought about all the times I had checked out of a conversation or felt overwhelmed when someone was telling a long story. Dr. Laura gave me a simple exercise. Read a short story each day, no more than 2 pages. Then try to retell it to someone else. It would help rebuild my ability to recall sequences, stay focused, and connect logical threads. She added, "Don't try to remember every little detail. Focus on the main idea and how the story flows. That's how the brain relearns to process information." And she was right. After just 2 weeks, I started following the news more clearly again. When friends called, I could track what they were saying without getting lost halfway through. It felt like a huge weight had been lifted. But then something else happened. And this time it wasn't about memory. It was about my emotions. One day my daughter was running 10 minutes late. I snapped at her over the phone. After I hung up, I felt confused. I knew I shouldn't have reacted that way. But in that moment, I couldn't stop myself. That was when I realized I had reached the fifth sign: unusual emotional changes. Something I never imagined could be tied to brain health. I remember it was a Wednesday afternoon. My daughter had texted to say she'd pick me up for dinner, but she showed up nearly 15 minutes late. As soon as she walked through the door, before she could even say sorry, I snapped, "Do you know how long I've been waiting? If you didn't want to come, you should have just said so." The room fell silent. She stood there, stunned, and softly said, "Dad, I just got stuck in traffic." That night I couldn't sleep. I knew I had overreacted, but I couldn't figure out why I got so angry. It wasn't like me. The next morning I told Dr. Laura what had happened. She listened quietly, then said calmly, "David, that wasn't your fault. It's actually an early sign of emotional regulation changes caused by a decline in prefrontal cortex activity." She explained that when this part of the brain weakens, it affects how we control our emotions and social behavior. People become more irritable, less tolerant of small changes, and sometimes overreact to minor situations. Then she shared a 2019 study from the University of Pittsburgh. Among adults over 65 showing early signs of cognitive decline, more than 38% reported becoming more sensitive and emotionally reactive often before memory problems became obvious. In that moment, I understood. All those times I thought I was just becoming grumpier or short-tempered with loved ones. It wasn't my personality changing. It was my brain sending a signal. Laura said, "Emotions are signals. If you pay attention to them early, they can tell you when the brain needs help." She suggested I try something simple. Every morning, before doing anything else, spend 5 minutes writing down 3 things I'm grateful for, no matter how small. This helps the brain start the day on a positive note and retrains the emotional regulation system. At first, it felt strange, but I gave it a try, and surprisingly, after just a week, I started feeling calmer. I didn't snap as easily. I laughed more when talking to my grandkids. Then one morning, as I wrote, "Today I'm grateful for the clear blue sky," I realized something. It had been days since I'd gotten angry without reason. I thought that once I had my emotions under better control, things would start to improve. But then, one morning, I was standing in the kitchen with the fridge door open. I was staring at the shelves. Milk, eggs, vegetables, they were all there. But I had no idea what I had come to get. I froze. Nearly a full minute passed. Then I asked myself, wait, why am I here? It wasn't the first time. I had walked into the living room before and forgotten why I went there. But this felt different. It was like my brain had momentarily disconnected. I told Dr. Laura about it during our next appointment. She looked at me with her usual calm and said, "David, this is one of the most important signs when the brain can no longer hold onto the purpose behind an action." She called it a loss of short-term behavioral orientation. It often shows up when there's declining activity in the frontal lobe and hippocampus, the two areas responsible for memory and goal direction. Laura shared a 2020 study from the Mayo Clinic with me. It found that 54% of people over 70 who experienced moments like walking into a room and forgetting why, or opening a drawer without remembering what they were looking for, were in the early stages of mild cognitive impairment. The problem, she said, is that most people don't talk about it. They brush it off as simple forgetfulness. I sat quietly thinking. I remembered all the times I stood holding the remote without knowing what show I wanted to watch, or picked up my phone but forgot who I meant to call. Small things, but when they pile up, they become a big thing. Laura didn't scare me. Instead, she gave me something very simple to try. Before each action, say out loud what you intend to do. For example, I'm going into the kitchen to get eggs. It sounds silly, but speaking it activates the prefrontal cortex and strengthens the brain's ability to stay goal-oriented in the moment. I tried it. It felt awkward at first, but slowly I started drifting off less. I stopped losing track of what I was doing in the middle of my day. After a few weeks of saying my intentions out loud, I started to feel more in control. Everything I did had a clear purpose. I wasn't drifting aimlessly between tasks anymore. But then I began to notice something else. It wasn't about memory. It wasn't about losing focus. It was about me. I stopped feeling excited about talking to friends. Even a phone call from an old buddy felt exhausting. Afternoon walks. I'd usually say no even when I had no real reason. I sat more, read less, listened to less music. Some days I just stayed in the house, staring out at the garden, not wanting to do anything at all. I kept thinking, maybe this is just what aging feels like. But Dr. Laura didn't think so. When I told her about these changes, she nodded and said, "David, that's your seventh early sign. Losing interest in things that once brought you joy. It's subtle but very important." She explained that it wasn't exactly depression. It was something called reduced neural motivation. It has to do with areas of the brain like the ventral striatum and prefrontal cortex regions responsible for motivation and the feeling of reward. Laura shared a study from the University of Pittsburgh, published in 2019. It found that among adults over 65, those who had withdrawn socially and lost interest in daily activities for over 4 weeks were nearly 60% more likely to experience cognitive decline within the next 3 years. I went quiet. I thought back to the days I felt dull and low for no reason. I remembered when my daughter asked me to join her at the weekend market, and I said no without even knowing why. Laura encouraged me to start small. Every day, write down 3 things I felt grateful for, and 1 thing I was looking forward to tomorrow. At first, it felt forced. Good coffee, sunny weather, my son called. But over time, I felt my heart opening up. I started looking forward to mornings again. And from there, I slowly reconnected with the things that made me feel alive. After I walked out of Dr. Laura's office that day, I didn't leave with a prescription. Instead, I left with 7 signs, 7 early warnings I had never noticed before. And more importantly, I left with 3 things Dr. Laura said would determine whether my brain could truly recover in the years to come. The first, deep, uninterrupted sleep. Not just lying in bed for 7 or 8 hours, but real sleep without tossing, turning, or waking up in the middle of the night. Because during deep sleep, the brain clears out the waste proteins that contribute to memory decline. The second, proper brain nutrition. A lot of people think cutting fat is healthy, but the brain actually needs good fats to build neurons, send signals, and store memories. So I started eating more fatty fish, walnuts, avocados, and dark leafy greens. I stopped fearing fat and started fueling my brain. And the third, maybe the most powerful of all, is human connection. The more meaningful conversations I have, the more alive my brain feels. Every time I tell a story, listen deeply, or laugh with my grandkids, I know I'm giving my brain a gift. I'm 73. I can't go back to 40. But with these small changes, I believe I can live out these later years with clarity, kindness, and peace. If you're my age, or if you have parents or loved ones who have started to forget things, please, don't brush it off as just aging. Confusion is not destiny. There's something we can do starting today. If my story helped you see something in yourself or someone you love, share it. It only takes 1 early sign to change the whole journey ahead. And if you want to know which foods may be quietly damaging your memory, every morning even though they're advertised as healthy, watch the next video. I made some big mistakes with my own breakfast, and I'll share everything. No holding back. Thank you for listening. Wishing you a sharp memory and a peaceful, graceful aging journey.